The Mau Mau Uprising, also known as the Mau Mau Revolt, Mau Mau Rebellion, or Kenya Emergency, was a military conflict that took place in British Kenya between 1952 and 1960. It involved Kikuyu-dominated groups summarily called Mau Mau, the white settlers including women and children and elements of the British Army. The local Kenya regiment mostly consisting of the British auxiliaries and anti-Mau Mau Kikuyu. The capture of rebel leader Dedan Kimathi on 21 October 1956 signaled the ultimate defeat of Mau Mau, and essentially ended the British military campaign. The Mau Mau failed to capture widespread public support, partly due to the British policy of divide and rule, and the movement remained internally divided, despite attempts to unify its various strands. The British, meanwhile, could draw upon their ongoing efforts to put down another rebellion in Malaya. The uprising created a rift between the European colonial community in Kenya and the metropole, but also resulted in violent divisions within the Kikuyu community. The financial cost of the uprising to the former colony amounted to £55 million. Etymology. The origin of the term Mau Mau is uncertain. According to some members of Mau Mau, they never refer to themselves as such, instead preferring the military title Kenya Land and Freedom Army. Some publications, such as Fred Magdalene's State of Emergency, The Full Story of Mau Mau, claim it was an anagram of Uma Uma and was a military code word based on a secret language game Kikuyu boys used to play at the time of their circumcision. Magdalene goes on to state that the British simply used the name as a label for the Kikuyu ethnic community without assigning any specific definition. As the movement progressed, a Swahili backronym was adopted, Mungu Ayende Ulaya, Mwafrika Apate Huru, meaning, let the foreigner go back abroad, let the African regain independence. J.M. Kariuki, a member of Mau Mau who was detained during the conflict, postulates that the British preferred to use the term Mau Mau instead of KLFA in an attempt to deny the Mau Mau rebellion international legitimacy. Kariuki also wrote that the term Mau Mau was adopted by the rebellion in order to counter what they regarded as colonial propaganda. Kenya before the emergency. The principal item in the natural resources of Kenya is the land, and in this term we include the colony's mineral resources. It seems to us that our major objective must clearly be the preservation and the wise use of this most important asset. Deputy Governor to Secretary of State for the Colonies, the 19th of March 1945. The primary British interest in Kenya was land, which, observed the British East Africa Commission of 1925, constituted some of the richest agricultural soils in the world, mostly in districts where the elevation and climate make it possible for Europeans to reside permanently, though declared a colony in 1920. The formal British colonial presence in Kenya began with a proclamation on 1 July 1895, in which Kenya was claimed as a British protectorate. Even before 1895, however, Britain's presence in Kenya was marked by dispossession and violence. In 1894, British MP Charles Dilke had observed in the House of Commons, "The only person who has up to the present time benefited from our enterprise in the heart of Africa has been Mr. Hiram Maxim." During the period in which Kenya's interior was being forcibly opened up for British settlement, there was plenty of conflict and British troops did on occasion carry out atrocities against the native population. The one-sided nature of fighting in Kenya led Churchill to express concern in 1948 about how it would look if word got out. 160 Gusii have now been killed outright without any further casualties on our side. It looks like a butchery. If the HFC gets hold of it, all our plans in EAP will be under a cloud. Surely it cannot be necessary to go on killing these defenseless people on such an enormous scale. Kenyan opposition to British imperialism was there from the start, an early example of which was the Kikuyu opposition of 1880 to 1900. It should be noted that, in military terms, armed uprisings during the opening scenes of British colonialism in Kenya were never successful. As mentioned, opposition to British colonialism in Kenya continued post-1895. The Nandi Revolt of 1895 to 1905, the Giriama Uprising of 1913-1914, the Women's Revolt against forced labor in Murang'a in 1947, and the Kalo Affray of 1950. Nor did Kenyan protest end with Mau Mau. In the years that followed, a series of successful non-violent boycotts were carried out. The Mau Mau rebellion can be regarded as a militant culmination of years of oppressive colonial rule and resistance to it, with its specific roots found in 3 episodes of Kikuyu history between 1920 and 1940. All of this is not, of course, to say that Kikuyu society was stable and harmonious before the British arrived. The Kikuyu in the 19th century were expanding and colonizing new territory and already internally divided between wealthy landowning families and landless ones, the latter dependent on the former in a variety of ways. Economic deprivation of the Kikuyu may travel through the length and breadth of Kitui Reserve and you will fail to find in it any enterprise, building, or structure of any sort which government has provided at the cost of more than a few sovereigns for the direct benefit of the natives. The place was little better than a wilderness when I first knew it 25 years ago, and it remains a wilderness today as far as our efforts are concerned. If we left that district tomorrow, the only permanent evidence of our occupation would be the buildings we have erected for the use of our tax-collecting staff. Chief Native Commissioner of Kenya. 1925. A feature of all settler societies during the colonial period was the ability of European settlers to obtain for themselves a disproportionate share in land ownership. Kenya was thus no exception, with the first white settlers arriving in 1902 as part of Governor Charles Elliott's plan to have a settler economy pay for the recently completed Uganda Railway. The success of this settler economy would depend heavily on the availability of land, labor and capital, and so, over the next 3 decades, the colonial government and settlers consolidated their control over Kenyan land, and encouraged native Kenyans to become wage laborers. Through a series of expropriations, the colony's government seized about 7 million acres of land, some of it in the especially fertile hilly regions of Central and Rift Valley provinces, areas later known as the White Highlands due to the exclusively European farmland which existed there. In particular, the British government's 1925 East Africa Commission noted, the treatment of the Giriama tribe from the coastal regions was very bad. This tribe was moved backwards and forwards so as to secure for the Crown areas which could be granted to Europeans, coupled with an increasing native Kenyan population. The land expropriation became an increasingly bitter point of contention. The Kikuyu, who lived in the Kiambu, Nyeri and Murang'a districts of Central Province, were the ethnic group most affected by the colonial government's land expropriation and European settlement. By 1933, they had had over 109.5 square miles of their potentially highly valuable land alienated. Strictly in terms of lost acreage, the Maasai and Nandi were the biggest losers. The Kikuyu did mount a legal challenge to the expropriation of their land, but a Kenya High Court decision of 1921 cemented its legality. As mentioned, the colonial government and white farmers also wanted cheap labor which for a period, the government acquired from native Kenyans through force. Confiscating the land itself helped to create a pool of wage laborers. But the colony introduced measures that forced more native Kenyans to submit to wage labor. The introduction of the hut and poll taxes, the establishment of reserves for each ethnic group, serving to isolate each ethnic group and exacerbate overcrowding, the discouragement of native Kenyans growing cash crops, the masters and servants ordinance and an identification pass known as the Kipanda to control the movement of labor and to curb desertion, and the exemption of wage laborers from forced labor and other compulsory detested tasks such as conscription. Native labor categories. Native Kenyan laborers were in one of three categories: squatter, contract, or casual. By the end of World War I, squatters had become well established on European farms and plantations in Kenya, with Kikuyu squatters comprising the majority of agricultural workers on settler plantations. An unintended consequence of colonial rule, the squatters were targeted from 1918 onwards by a series of resident native laborers' ordinances, criticized by at least some MPs, which progressively curtailed squatter rights and subordinated native Kenyan farming to that of the settlers. The Ordinance of 1939 finally eliminated squatters' remaining tenancy rights, and permitted settlers to demand 270 days' labor from any squatters on their land. And, after World War II, the situation for squatters deteriorated rapidly, a situation the squatters resisted fiercely. In the early 1920s, though, despite the presence of 100,000 squatters and tens of thousands more wage laborers, there was still not enough native Kenyan labor available to satisfy the settlers' needs. The colonial government duly tightened the measures to force more Kenyans to become low-paid wage laborers on settler farms. The colonial government used the measures brought in as part of its land expropriation and labor encouragement efforts to craft the third plank of its growth strategy for its settler economy, subordinating African farming to that of the Europeans. Nairobi also assisted the settlers with rail and road networks, subsidies on freight charges, agricultural and veterinary services, and credit and loan facilities. The near-total neglect of native farming during the first 2 decades of European settlement was noted by the East Africa Commission. The resentment of colonial rule would not have been decreased by the wanting provision of medical services for native Kenyans, nor by the fact that in 1923, for example, the maximum amount that could be considered to have been spent on services provided exclusively for the benefit of the native population was slightly over 1/4 of the taxes paid by them. The tax burden on Europeans in the early 1920s, meanwhile, was very light. Interwar infrastructure development was also largely paid for by the indigenous population. Kenyan employees were often poorly treated by their European employers, sometimes even beaten to death by them, with some settlers arguing that native Kenyans were as children and should be treated as such. It was widely acknowledged that few settlers hesitated to flog their servants for petty offences. To make matters even worse, native Kenyan workers were poorly served by colonial labor legislation and a prejudiced legal system. The vast majority of Kenyan employees' violations of labor legislation were settled with rough justice meted out by their employers. Most colonial magistrates appear to have been unconcerned by the illegal practice of settler-administered flogging. Indeed, during the 1920s, flogging was the magisterial punishment of choice for native Kenyan convicts. The principle of punitive sanctions against workers was not removed from the Kenyan labor statutes until the 1950s. The greater part of the wealth of the country is at present in our hands. This land we have made is our land by right of achievement. Speech by Deputy Colonial Governor 30 November 1946. Until the mid-1930s, the two primary complaints were low native Kenyan wages and the Kipanda. From the early 1930s, however, two others began to come to prominence: effective and elected African political representation, and land. The British response to this clamour for agrarian reform came in the early 1930s when they set up the Carter Land Commission. The commission reported in 1934, but its conclusions Recommendations and concessions to Kenyans were so conservative that any chance of a peaceful resolution to native Kenyan land hunger was ended. In Nyanza, for example, the Commission restricted 1,029,422 native Kenyans to 7,114 square miles, while granting 16,700 square miles to 17,000 Europeans. By the 1930s, and for the Kikuyu in particular, land had become the #1 grievance concerning colonial rule. The situation so acute by 1948 that 1,250,000 Kikuyu had ownership of 2,000 square miles, while 30,000 British settlers owned 12,000 square miles. As a result of the situation in the highlands, thousands of Kikuyu migrated into cities in search of work, contributing to the doubling of Nairobi's population between 1938 and 1952. At the same time, there was a small, but growing, class of Kikuyu landowners who consolidated Kikuyu lands and forged strong ties with the colonial administration, leading to an economic rift within the Kikuyu. Around 1943, a resident of Olenguruwan radicalized the traditional Kikuyu practice of oathing, and extended oathing to women and children. By the mid-1950s, 90% of Kikuyu, Embu and Meru were oathed. Kenyan politics. The first attempt to form a countrywide political party occurred on 1 October 1944. This fledgling organization was called the Kenya African Study Union. Its inaugural chairman was Harry Thuku, who soon resigned his chairmanship. There is dispute over Thuku's reason for leaving KASU. Bethwell Oggett states that Thuku found the responsibility too heavy. David Anderson states that he walked out in disgust as the militant section of KASU took the initiative. KASU changed its name to the Kenya African Union in 1946. By the late 1940s, the Kikuyu were a deeply divided people, increasingly in conflict among themselves as well as with the colonial political and economic order. The failure of the KAU to attain any significant reforms or redress of grievances from the colonial authorities shifted the political initiative to younger and more militant figures within the native Kenyan trade union movement. Among the squatters on the settler estates in the Rift Valley and in cow branches in Nairobi and the Kikuyu districts of Central Province,